Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ellen Kuwana. We are just transitioning the board for 2022. So I'm the incoming president of Northwest Science Writers Association. And I'd like to start tonight after thanking everyone for setting aside valuable time to join us today, especially our panelists, but to also do a quick land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the native land on which we are all learning, working, and organizing today. We offer land acknowledgement because native land was colonized to form the United States as we know it today. This acknowledgement is the first step in opposing the systematic oppression and historic erasure of native people and native land ownership. For those of us here in Seattle, its green spaces are on stolen Coast Salish land, including the Duwamish people, past and present. Indigenous people have been talked about in the past tense and could lead others to believe that the struggles they face are also in the past tense. It's easier to deny Indigenous people their rights if we historicize their struggles. As science communicators, we shape perceptions of the world around us through the words we choose to use. Through our actions and our words, we can remind ourselves and others that we need to remedy land, social, and other injustices through our beliefs and actions in helping to steward our green spaces and the communities where we live. So thank you for that. I wanted to give a very brief overview of Northwest Science Writers. We are one of the oldest and largest science writing regional groups in the United States. I would like to thank our outgoing president, Ashley Braun, for her wonderful leadership last year through a difficult year of online events, as well as our outgoing treasurer, Mark Harris, outgoing board members, Rachel Tompa and David Mills. We will have our annual party on March 10th, we hope, outside safely here in Seattle, with sponsors the Allen Institute and Seattle Children's. You can join. For the past 2 years, I advocated for, and we have a $1 pandemic hardship rate, which I took 1 year. So please join us. We'd rather have you than have price be any barrier. There are also student rates, regular rate of $30 and a benefactor rate of $60 if anyone wants to help fund some of our programs, which are, we have a mentorship partnership or accountability partnership that we pair up people and help them help other people throughout the year with their career goals. We have a writing award program. We have a career development funds that we do once a year, and we do an event approximately once a year. So we're always open to your ideas. So please don't hesitate to let us know. And when you become a member, you can access all past events, which are recorded on our website. So that's a brief overview of us. And Mara has put together this wonderful panel on using humor with to address misinformation, which is extremely timely. Mara is an award-winning journalist. She's written for Slate, Hakai, New York Times for Kids, among other high-profile media outlets. She's an editor and an author of WTF Evolution, a Theory of Unintelligible Design. And she has been the recipient of the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award for Children's Science News in 2014. And I love on her website, she says she has surveyed ornithologists about the fanciest dancing birds. So I highly encourage you to check out her website. It was highly entertaining and informative. So Mara, I hand it over to you, and thank you so much, everyone, for your time and your expertise in joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen, for that lovely intro. I wish I remembered off the top of my head what the result of the Fancy Dancing Birds survey was, because there were a lot of them. But yeah, thank you. Thank you to our panelists for joining us, and thank you to our audience for joining us. We are here today for a discussion about the potential usefulness of humor in fighting misinformation about science. I know this is something a lot of us have been thinking about lately, between anti-vaccination campaigns, climate change denial, what seems like general mistrust of science and scientists in certain corners. Just today, I was reading about how Neil Young just pulled his music from Spotify in protest of their platforming Joe Rogan, who has shared misleading information about vaccines and climate change on his podcast, which is one of the most popular ones in America. And if you had told me 10 years ago that that was something we would be talking about right now, I probably would have thought that that was a joke, but here we are. So we have assembled a panel of experts who I'm really looking forward to talking to, who can hopefully help us make some sense of all of this and think about what might be some alternative strategies other than yelling into the void about how to maybe try to correct some of this misinformation. I will give some brief introductions, and then hopefully we can learn a bit more about everyone and their work as we go along. Questions are great. Feel free to throw questions in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will get to them either during the conversation or in a Q&A section at the end. All right, so joining us tonight, we have Dr. Sara K, who is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Utah. Her research explores the intersection of science, media, and politics, and recently she's been interested in how emotions and humor affect the formation of public attitudes toward science and technology. And one of her recent papers about this was one of the things that kind of inspired this whole event. So thank you for that, Dr. Yo. Dr. Rachel Moran is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. Her research explores the role of trust in digital information environments, and particularly how trust is implicated in the spread of misinformation and disinformation. She's also a contributor, I just noticed, to the Virality Project, which is a coalition of experts who are focused on detecting and analyzing and responding to false and misleading information about COVID-19 in real time. We also have with us Eve Andrews. Eve is a staff writer at the environmental news website brisk.org and the longtime writer of Ask Umbra, which is a lovely advice column for readers with various questions about environmental practices and generally living ethically and trying to be a good person with climate change. And as Eve's Twitter bio puts it, everything else that is going on. Finally, last but certainly not least, we have Sara Siskind and Dr. Carolyn Ayers. They are the co-founders of Hello SciCom, which is a consultancy where they work with scientists and companies to help them deliver their messages in an entertaining and engaging and hopefully effective way. Sarah's background is in TV comedy writing. She worked for Neil deGrasse Tyson's Star Talk and the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner, among others. And Carolyn is a statistician and a science writer with a PhD in population biology, ecology, and evolution. Okay, that's everybody. I'm Mara. Hi. So my first question to jump in is maybe we can start with just kind of getting some common ground here. I'm curious from our academics in particular, what is misinformation? When we say that, like, what are we talking about and how do you go about trying to, you know, quantify and study something like that? Rachel, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure, I can take that. So kind of colloquially, misinformation just refers to misleading or inaccurate information, and mostly we're kind of turning to study the spread of that in digital or online environments. We also have this word disinformation. So we define mis and disinformation slightly differently. Misinformation and disinformation are both information that has low facticity, so isn't real. But misinformation is generally seen as information that's unintentionally spread. So people might actually believe in it or they don't realize that it's wrong, whereas disinformation is intentionally spread in order to cause harm. The difficulty in that lies in trying to get at people's intent, which is a little bit more tricky, as you can probably assume. So usually we tend towards using that phrase misinformation, so we don't have to go into the quagmire of intent. But yeah, I guess that's it. And in terms of kind of trying to measure the existence of misinformation, it's very difficult. There's a lot of gray areas, and it's also become such a weaponized term. Like we're seeing now a lot of politicians on both sides use the term misinformation, just as they use the term fake news to describe something they just don't like or don't like to hear from the other side. So it means that it's really difficult for us to sort of concretely measure how much misinformation is out there. We also don't really have good access to data when it comes to different platforms. So we find many different inventive ways to try doing it, whether it's embedding ourselves in different communities online where we're likely to see misinformation. I myself, unfortunately, spend a lot of time in the QAnon space and just hanging out with conspiracy theorists. And that's how I find a lot of my misinformation. But there are
You need a hug.
Yeah, definitely every day. But there are kind of more systematic ways of trying to like use access to Twitter data and things like that to try and track the spread of rumors or misinformation online. But Sarah might want to add on to that too.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm curious if that is that similar to how you think about it, and I'm curious how you sort of came to this as something to study.
Yeah. So, I'm an associate professor, actually. I think I have changed a bio somewhere because
oh dear, okay,
but that's okay. I'll just take it as a compliment. Yeah, no, that's how I
misinformation on my part, but not.
No, that's okay
because it was not intentional.
That's okay.
I apologize.
No, yeah, I think about misinformation kind of in the same way as Rachel, where typically, and I think this is true of a lot of comm scholars, we tend to stay away from using disinformation because, again, you can't ascribe intent necessarily, right, to online content that is posted, primarily on social media. So, in honesty, I don't actually study a lot of misinformation. I think more about how humor can be used as sort of a strategy or a tactic around good communication of science, right? So correction of misinformation, identification of misinformation, these are really thorny, difficult things to do, as Rachel can probably say more about. A lot of minds much brighter than mine, or for example, are working on identifying misinformation, right, in the online space. And what do you do about that? How do you moderate that? And so, I like to spend time thinking more about how we can use other strategies like humor or emotion, right, to think about effective science communication.
Awesome. Great. So I'm curious about, maybe again, both of you can talk about this, but what do we know about sort of the ways that false narratives spread, and then what is the evidence that we have or that you have found, Dr. Yo, about how a humorous approach can actually help?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of misinformation spread, what we know is that it tends to be framed in ways that are sort of attention grabbing, right? And so it's sort of very clickbait-esque. And so it attracts our attention, for example. It's easy to share, right? As we all know, a lot of science information is not bite-sized necessarily. It's not particularly conducive to rapid information sort of dissemination, right? Whereas misinformation is not framed in this way. And so when I think, for example, about how we can use humor to sort of overcome that, right? And I haven't necessarily tested humor as a corrective strategy. I know, and some people have, but again, the results are not entirely clear, right? It works in some cases, and in some cases, humor doesn't necessarily work. So I also don't want to dominate the conversation, so I'm going to turn it over to Rachel for a minute. She knows more, I think, about misinformation spread than I do, because that's not necessarily my sort of focus area.
Sure.
I would say the main thing that we know about misinformation is that it spreads like wildfire in conditions of uncertainty. So what we do find is there's almost two different kinds of misinformation camps. There is straight not factual information that we see floating around online that we're always trying to fact check, but this is also this other phenomenon that we see where people just are trying to amplify that uncertainty. So and that a lot of that comes from the top down. You'll see sort of elite voices and especially politicians amp up uncertainty by presenting something and saying, I'm just asking questions. Maybe we should take a second look at this. And that frame of uncertainty ends up making this misinformation feel a lot more salient or sticky to different people. And we study misinformation across many different realms, unfortunately, and We tend to have kind of the standing misinformation that has widely been debunked, particularly in the science context. We're looking at things around climate change that have continuously been debunked. The problem is that now that's boring. We have massive amounts of consensus about the fact that, one, climate change is happening, and secondly, that it is a human impacted phenomena that people are still sort of trying to discredit through misinformation. And so they have to find new ways of doing it, and those new ways tend to be more exciting. So tying it to a crisis event like the power grid going down in Texas, for example. So trying to find those sort of unique ties allows us to sort of allows misinformation spreaders, of which I am not, hopefully, allows them to tie it to sort of novel events and make it seem even more attractive than the kind of boring science. And the last thing I'll add is, like, one of the other things that we find within the spread of misinformation is the undermining of scientific consensus. So a lot of the issues that we've found around COVID is this idea that there is a lack of consensus about the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. Overwhelmingly, all of the data that we have points to how great these vaccines are and continue to be. And yet, because of social media, there's this amplification of one or two or a minority of voices that have, unfortunately, doctor in front of their name or PhD after their name, that then get elevated to suggest there's not this consensus. And again, that uncertainty comes into play. So a lot of fear and uncertainty happening in the spread of misinformation.
Great. I mean, not great, but thank you for explaining that. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we're, talking about humor, and we're talking about Joe Rogan, who is a comedian and was, hosted Fear Factor and whatever. And I wonder how much, the fact that he's presenting this information as entertainment. I wonder if that's something that you see as well when you're on QAnon forums and wherever else. Like, is it, is everyone joking around and in the process, spreading these ideas that are harmful?
Yeah, unfortunately, humor works both ways. Like, a lot of the more extreme sort of conspiratorial thinking that we see is sometimes, treading the line between a joke and a reality, because it's suggesting that something is completely far-fetched. And, sometimes when you hear something completely far-fetched, you assume it's a joke. But in the QAnon space, it's usually a prediction. And so that is, humor is a weapon that is definitely being used on the misinformation side. So I have hope that we can use it on the information side too, as a way of attracting some of that attention away from the misinformed narratives.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I will get to our writers in a minute, I promise. But Dr. Yo, you had a paper come out recently called Emotion and Humor as Misinformation Anecdotes, that talks specifically about how humor and kind of funny science can potentially combat misinformation. It includes some really amazing sentences that are, I think, an attempt to encapsulate scientifically things that we sort of understand emotionally. My favorite was, when someone makes another person laugh, a recipient associates the source of humor with the pleasure of laughing. Which, I don't know, just made me think about how, I don't know, talking and writing about being funny, I feel like sometimes gets a little funny itself. Anyway, could you tell us a little bit about what you looked at for that paper and what you found about how humor can help in this situation?
Yeah, so that's mostly sort of a review piece based on a colloquium talk I gave on the topic. I will say kind of research on science humor it's not new, but there's not a lot of it, right? So there was a time, at least research and communication on humor, right? The political communication space, you can imagine there's a lot of research on The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, things like this. In the science communication space, there's less research on humor. And so what we do know so far, right, is that humor generally works with some caveats. Okay, so humor works for things like getting more people to engage with science. We run some experiments where we show people a tweet that is humorous, that has some types of humor. And for the most part, things are as expected. Oh, hang on. Bad audio. Let me fix this. So sorry.
Oh, no.
Somebody
it's fine.
else.
I think she was just spreading the truth, and the deep state is trying to cut her off.
That's probably it. Yeah.
No.
Is this better?
So
Yeah.
far, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Deep state totally derailed my train of thought. I will also say that I don't recall writing that sentence, which doesn't mean I didn't write that sentence. I just like wrote it down and then it left my brain, right?
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yeah, so the things about science humor, it works, but there are caveats. The types of humor that you use matter, right? So when we don't necessarily think about what types of humor we're using every day, but you know, in science, it tends to be a lot of puns, for example, right? So I would kind of count these a lot as dad jokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, dads. I think you can be funny too. I'm not going to offend anyone here. But so, you know, sort of puns are encouraging, right? They encourage people to engage with humor after viewing puns, for example, things like anthropomorphism, which are very obvious kind of signs of humor. Because you can imagine that in the science humor realm, right, there might be some knowledge required to get a joke about science. Whereas something like anthropomorphism doesn't necessarily require sort of that background knowledge, right? And so these are the types of humor that can have positive outcomes for science. But there are types that you could imagine, like satire or sarcasm, that speak to some groups and not others. And so I think as communicators, we have to be kind of thoughtful on how we use that, right? How we use those particular types of humor, which also are quite common in science.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of the most common types of humor in science are sarcasm, satire, and then also wordplay.
Get a bunch of nerds together. That's what you're gonna get.
Can I jump in on that, on the different?
Yeah, go for it. Please.
It's like that's what we do. I was just training an employee today on a bunch of stuff, so I'm looking over my corner at the whiteboard. And so we've got metaphor, which is like similar to anthropomorphization, which is just great to like take a realm somebody understands and bring something esoteric to that realm. Then there's like, oh, this is a good one, rewards. John Oliver does this all the time where he's like, if you can get through this boring thing, I promise you a cute video of a cat at the end. And so now you've got like sort of like a structure where there's like a reward at the end. It's also a similar version of this is called Chekhov's gun, where you have some sort of like, let's say a physicist and a comedian are talking about air pressure. And the physicist is like, okay, just so you know, this balloon could explode at any minute while I talk to you about air pressure. Then you've got like this sort of like bomb in the middle of the conversation that could go off at any point. So that's kind of like a reward at the end. Then there's like absurd applications for science. Like I was trying to relay a metaphor recently about like scaling, how quickly things can scale out. And so I used a metaphor of thinking about like Amy Schumer eating a sandwich out of the garbage is like 1 meter by 1 meter like long. And then if you scale out 10 meters by 10 meters, you might see she's in the back of an Arby's. If you scale out just 2 more factors, so you're like 1,000 by 1,000 meters, you can see she's in like Reno, Nevada. And I use that where it's like an absurd application of like a scientific principle. And all of these are like helpful tools that are so much easier than just like saying the thing straight or applying it to an uninteresting application. So those just are a couple of things that we've been going through to help our scientists communicate.
Nice. Thanks for that. And actually, while you're unmuted, I wanted to ask you two a little bit about how you found Hello SciCom. I know we were talking before about sort of trying to do a daily show for science kind of thing. Like, you know, what, I know you weren't setting out to fight misinformation necessarily, but how did you from your 2 different backgrounds come to found this company trying to make science more funny?
Yeah, so we were actually working both for this startup that had this humanoid robot, and she would travel the world. She'd been to like 60 different countries, and she'd be on like panels like this one, but she was talking about artificial intelligence and like ethics in AI and technology. So in a sense, she was kind of combating misinformation. And so we were both writing for this robot and we were helping program her. And so what we noticed is like a lot of times the scientist she was on the panel with also wanted our help with like punching up what they were going to say. And so when the pandemic hit, you know, this kind of winded down for a while. So that's when we decided to offer our services, you know, to the world at large, not just for the panels that the robot was going to be on.
Yeah, that's how I met my business wife, and we've been in love ever since.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And yes, Ashley Ron, robots is correct. Sophia the robot.
Awesome. Eve, how does this come into play in your work? Are you, I know you cover a lot of different things. How do you think about when should I try to be funny about this? When is it too serious to be funny about? Are you thinking about whether that's going to help you be convincing or informative, or is it kind of, just what comes to you?
So the sentence that Sara does not remember writing really spoke to me because I think I would say there's been, like, I personally have been on such a trajectory of using humor over the course of my career. And I know if I went back and read the things that I wrote when I started at Grist, I would be very embarrassed because I know that I was trying pretty overtly to be funny because I thought that wasn't something that was really happening that much in climate journalism, and that was really Grist's MO at the time. But now that I'm older and wiser, I feel that the value of humor in climate journalism is so much more like kind of building a rapport with your audience. Like if you can make them think that you are a funny person, that you are a person they would enjoy talking to, that is going to make them trust you more, and that's going to make them more interested in your work. And I feel like using humor with more that like light personality touch rather than overt, like, here's a joke about global warming and carbon emissions. My personal feeling is that is kind of a more effective strategy just in my work.
Dr. Moran and Dr. Yo, does that kind of track with what you found that, coming off as humorous and personable makes people more trustworthy?
Yeah, I think one of the trickiest things we find with combating misinformation is because it's at a time now where trust in institutions such as journalism is incredibly shaky, that we can provide all the fact checks we want to people, but they're not going to believe them because they do not either like the outlet they're coming from or they don't trust it. And so addressing that issue of distrust and building relationships of trust within audiences is so central to being able to kind of actually effectively be able to provide accurate information. So that definitely tracks for me. I also think that a lot of misinformation is oriented towards inaction. So, you believe in misinformation about climate change, there's no action for you there. You believe in misinformation about the COVID vaccine, you don't have to get the vaccine. There's inaction, and that can be pretty depressing. And I think something that humor does is open a door towards action instead. It's like engaging people to have a further conversation. We can never change someone's mind about misinformation in a single conversation, but the aim is to get them to want to talk to you again. So I think humor can be a really effective pathway to that.
Yeah, and I do have sort of this hypothesis about humor as this kind of gateway to lowering defenses, right? To sort of rationally processing information. But in terms of likability and expertise and how that changes humor, in my research, I've at least found that using a scientist who uses humor, right, comes off as more likable. So anecdotally, I hear from a lot of people that scientists are not very warm, they're not very personable, right? But we find in our research that humor can kind of overcome that. They can make them more likable, they can make them seem more like a regular person, but it also, that if they can make people laugh, right, it has an effect of also potentially increasing their credibility. People also perceive that they are more of an expert in sort of the areas they are. And then, you know, that can have downstream effects. Of course, the follow-up question to that is, right, who is the scientist? I see Allie. I was just wondering, Allie, if that was that Allie. Hi, Allie. Yes, you're very personable as a scientist. Apologies. But yeah, and so, oh, Allie, totally derailed that train. She's so great. Science Talk, everyone, in March. If you don't go, you should go. It's really great fun. And you get to hang out with Allie. Yeah, so it does make scientists seem more personable, with the exception of Allie, because she's always personable. So I would recommend the use of humor. In terms of humor as sort of the gateway to kind of lowering defenses to, I think one might say, more rational information processing, right? There's competing hypotheses about how humor might do that. And I'm happy to talk about that more, but gets kind of dry, right? It gets into kind of cognitive and social psychology. And so I think I'll just leave it there for now.
Great. Sara and Carolyn, is it possible to teach scientists to be more funny and personable if they are not already, or do you just have to like find the ones who are and nourish them? What's your strategy there?
Great question. I would say there's one important indicator test, which is if they can recognize humor, there's hope. If they can't really recognize humor, then it's like trying to describe colors to a blind person. It's very difficult for them to cross that chasm. But honestly, a lot of comedy writing is a craft rather than an art. So like there's a fair amount that is surprisingly teachable. So yeah, it's not a lost cause.
But I wanted to add, like, one thing we've come across a lot with our clients we work with is like a lot of times, like, they are very funny and personable, but when they're talking about science, like,
right,
especially if they're like a woman, they're like, I have to be really serious. Like, I have to show that I know what I'm talking about. And they're worried, like, no one will take them seriously if they're funny. So a lot of it is just assuring them, like, no, you know, actually they might, you know, find you more credible, or like, and just building that confidence.
Right. Yeah, Sarah's study is very helpful. You know, reading through that was, very informative for us personally in our work, because people get PhDs, you know, decades of experience to be like, fucking trust me when I say this shit, like I know what I'm talking about. And so they think, you know, if I take a second to have some levity, it's going to ruin all those years. I promise you, one joke is not going to invalidate your PhD. It's going to make you're going to be a lot more personable and trustworthy.
Right. Well, and Carolyn hinted at this, but I'm sure there are also some differences in who feels like they're allowed and who is actually allowed to, you know, be less serious without worrying that that's going to threaten their academic standing or their perception among their colleagues.
And that's what I was about to say when Allie derailed me, but
there you go.
I was just going to say something about the identity of the scientist matters, right? In terms of who you are. You know, I was just looking, sort of our follow-up study to that is changing who the scientist is, the race of the scientist, the gender of the scientist, telling the same joke. Is it perceived as funny, right? There was a 2007 article in Vanity Fair or something that said women aren't funny. Some of us probably remember this, right? It just flat out said women aren't funny. And, you know, I don't necessarily think that's true, obviously, but so this is kind of the follow-up study. And so far we're finding that the results are largely positive, right? We also sort of changed whether they were labeled as a scientist or a comedian. People generally found the scientists slightly more kind of credible in terms of asking them about, well, you know, as a scientist, but they thought across the board, didn't matter if it was a Black woman or a white woman or a Black man or a white man, they sort of had similar levels of humor.
Awesome.
Just to like back up that point, like an anecdote throughout history that breaks my heart is like the anecdote of Rosalind Franklin, who like was, she took a photograph, like an x-ray of the structure of the DNA, like the DNA helix. And she had the photograph, but she sat on it for a while because she wanted to absolutely verify that it was accurate, because she was so worried about being discredited because she was a female in a male dominated field. And then, you know, Watson essentially stole the photograph from her and put it in his paper. And to me, that is a real example of why, like, anybody who is the outgroup in a field has like an insecurity about being taken seriously, which is really unfortunate, because oftentimes that can be self-defeating, because you'll delay publishing, or you won't, you know, frankly, be very charismatic in your presentation of your ideas. So there are ways in which that like is a really unfortunate insecurity.
Wendy Katz makes a good point in the chat too, which is, she says, I like to think that being able to be humorous in relation to your topic would send the message that I know my stuff so well, I don't have to sound serious all the time. I like that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we
Sorry.
can talk a little more. No, it's fine. I want to talk a little more about sort of what types of humor might be more and less effective. Eve, I don't know if you find this, but I see a lot of humor about climate change that I don't like, because some of it tends toward like, haha, the world is ending, you know, which is both its own kind of misinformation and doesn't inspire action particularly, like Rachel was talking about. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? And for the rest of the panel, do you have any thoughts on sort of what strategies and what things are better and worse to be funny about?
Yeah, I feel like that kind of gallows humor, it ends up being very much like climate journalists, like trying to be funny with each other, which honestly nobody cares about. Like nobody needs to hear that or know that. It's not like, it's not really helpful for the world. And the type of climate humor, I mean, I think this is just a general rule for really any kind of work and any kind of life really, but any humor that kind of makes fun of your audience or like makes fun of a certain group, it's not, I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's definitely not going to make you seem likable to what we talked about earlier. It's definitely not going to make you seem like a trustworthy source of information. And I honestly, I'm almost loath to bring this up, but one thing that that kind of rubbed me the wrong way about Don't Look Up, the movie, was that it felt like it just kept poking fun at like, oh, you stupid, like American masses, like on your phones all the time, you don't care about the right things, like you deserve to get burned in the fires of climate change or hit by a comet or whatever. And 2.5 hours of that, you're like, okay, I'm not sure what people are supposed to walk away with. Like, I feel like this movie just spent so much time making fun of people who it's supposed to be like activating theoretically. And yeah, I mean, again, just to sum up, I think the general rule of successful humor is you want the people you're talking to, the people you're addressing, to be in on the joke, to feel like they're a part of the group. You don't want them to feel like antagonized by you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I also watched Don't Look Up, and yeah, there were definitely jokes that were funny, but I can't say it left me feeling particularly motivated, or I didn't feel better after watching it. So it was effective at convincing me of something, but probably not the kind of thing we want. Does anyone have examples of people you see doing this effectively as when it comes to science? Or is that something that we and our audience watching right now have to go out and create.
I just wanted to mention something that came up in the chat. Sally James is talking about kind of following up on what Eve said in terms of humor is a form of social control, right? I mean, you sort of create an in-group and an out-group by using humor because you're thinking about who gets the joke, right? And the person who doesn't get the joke or the group that doesn't get the joke is left out of that, right? And so this is kind of the caveat in our research that we found in terms of the types of humor one uses, right? Satire and sarcasm are very biting forms of humor as opposed to wordplay, right? Or anthropomorphism or even slapstick, the physical types of humor that Sarah was describing earlier. Those are more benign forms of humor. There's less of a target in that humor, right? And so when it comes to kind of the more targeted humor, it's hard to tell who's going to find that funny. So who's going to be in the in-group and out-group, right? And different groups are going to find different aspects of a joke or of a movie funnier.
Yeah, that's called Juvenalian satire, when it's like, trying to tear down somebody or a group. I think like my view is a little bit less, more, for the most part, descriptive rather than prescriptive about humor, because if people find it funny, like as a stand-up, there's a saying, it's like the audience is never wrong. Like if people find something funny, it says something about the emotional tone of where people are at. And like I also found Don't Look Up super depressing. Nihilism humor is not my favorite, but like it is, it's cathartic for people, that kind of like gallows humor. So that says something. And it is slim pickings to think about like climate-based humor that is like somewhat optimistic. Like Eve's, kind of point made me start thinking about like, can I think of anything that's kind of positive? And the only thing I could think of with regards to like funny climate change stuff was a 30 Rock episode that like featured Al Gore. And at one point, and Al Gore plays like a bizarre climate change superhero. And at one point he's talking to another character and he goes, "Shh, a whale is in trouble." And then runs off. And it that's like the only thing I can think of that was like pretty good. I think one thing that the media should maybe do is celebrate the wins more in like climate stuff. Cause like, the ozone layer hole, which was like the existential issue of my youth, like is like mostly solved now due to the like ban on CFCs. And like, I just found that out like a couple months ago, Googling it. And it was like, there should have been like a parade.
You were still walking around worrying about it and
I was like, oh no, the hole, like what's gonna happen with the hole? And I kind of forgot about it. And then I was like, oh no, Australia. And then Googled it. And I think we should have a pizza party, because when I was growing up, that was how you measured success in your classroom, was you get a pizza party. So the world fixed the ozone hole. And I think that we should have a pizza party about it.
I like that. Yeah. Or Ashley suggests ozone hole healing parades.
Yes.
That works too. Just no like hairspray at the parade.
Yeah. Fix the hole.
Yeah. Also, just as another good example of humorous writing about climate change, everyone go read Eve's work. Cool. Well, I think we might donut hole parties. Yes, Ashley, there is a successful ozone hole related joke. So we can start taking some questions from the audience. If people have questions they want to pop in the chat or Q&A. While they type, this last bit of conversation made me think a little bit about just what might be more effective on different platforms. Like, it seems like the gallows humor thing might be kind of cathartic if it's, like Eve said, one climate journalist talking to another and, letting off some steam about what they dealt with that day. It might not be as effective broadcast to everyone, because we don't want them to think like, oh no, the climate journalists think the world is ending. That's not a good sign. And it seems like, at least in some cases, like Twitter, for instance, has the potential to kind of flatten all that and everything just goes to everyone. Eve, you made quite a face. Do you have thoughts about this?
I wish I remembered more details about this, but there's somebody I follow on Twitter, nothing to do with climate journalism. And they have such an amazing divide between things they say that I'm like, yeah, 100% spot on, and things they say that I'm like, you're an idiot and I can't believe anybody thinks like this. And they said, again, they're totally outside of like climate journalism, science journalism, and they were tweeting something about climate change, and I got so mad about it. And I'm sure I was already in a bad mood that day, and I tweeted something really just like snarky and rude about it. And somebody messaged me about it who I don't know, and they were like, this like really made me angry. Like I feel like you were making light of climate activism and like all of the hard work that climate activists do. And like, I felt terrible. It ruined my whole day. And it was just like, because I had to express some feelings about this person who I feel doesn't know anything. And someone who follows me and let me know like they really like respect my work, and that I had said something that really made them upset. And that, yeah, that it's just one in a billion examples of Twitter not being the right vehicle for a message. That's all I have to say about it.
Rachel, you just wrote something about the context collapse of social media. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I mean, just to kind of Eve's point, it's so hard all of our communications are so networked now that we think that we're saying something to one audience, but really we're saying it to this huge public. And so the meaning is dramatically changed when it's taken in by a public that you didn't intend it to, or even taken to a different platform space. Like one of the ways we see kind of backfiring is like a lot of the misinformation, or at least within the kind of partisan, mostly right-wing ecosphere when it comes to climate change, is often pointing to the hypocrisy of elite politicians of doing one thing and then appearing at a climate change conference next week, and they'll find some way to tie it together. You know, Obama bought this house and now he's at this climate change conference talking about how terrible the world is, and somehow those things are connected and show his hypocrisy. That, you know, our lives are open to everyone and everything we do is open to scrutiny because of how hyper visible we are on these platforms. So it is really difficult to communicate, I think, even harder than ever.
Ellen had asked earlier, kind of leading off of that, are there types of humor that might work better in writing versus in person? Are there kind of guidelines around that? I don't know, Sara and Carolyn, if you have rules of thumb.
I do not know of much empirical evidence specifically around humor and sort of media format, but if I had to guess, I would be looking into kind of how people process textual information versus visual information, and sort of the things that those elicit, right, in us. So Eve's kind of anecdotal example is a really good one of how emotion can kind of drive us to do things, right, and to take action, to form different attitudes, you know, and anger is one of those emotions in general have sort of this approach or avoidance tendency. Anger is one of those emotions that kind of have an approach tendency. So you kind of want to do something about it, right? You want to go toward the thing that has angered you. And so, you know, I think there's also, you know, some things that people find funny, others, it might make other people angry. This is the thing about biting humor and satire and sarcasm, right?
Umar,
Go ahead.
About text versus performative humor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think like, especially for performance, that's the most person-based. Like you really can't teach somebody to perform like different than how they actually are, especially if they're a scientist and they have better things to do than practice fart jokes in the mirror like I do. you don't have the bandwidth to teach them, how to be dry and British or how to be slapstick or whatever. So that is the most like interpersonal, which is why we do like, that has to usually be like workshops where we actually work with them for a little while. And then for the like text-based stuff, you have to do extra legwork there to make sure your tone is perfectly understood. That like, for example, if you're, making a self-deprecating comment, that it doesn't come across as like a humble brag or something like that, because people can really misinterpret that. There's more room for error, whereas people can get it much more like from like how you deliver the joke, that you have good intentions. Like I think, what did you call it, Rachel? The context collapse. That's a great term.
Yeah, and one other observation, and this is more about the people who work for us versus our clients, but I noticed like a lot of comedians are very like straight faced in person, but when you read what they write, they are hilarious. So I think it might come down to like who you are as a person and like what medium you're most comfortable with. So it may be like one's not better than the other, but just like, what you're comfortable with.
Yeah, like we have one client who's like a cybersecurity expert who's like always doing, really helpful PSAs about democratizing cybersecurity. And she absolutely loves visual aids. Like she is very, it would be hard for her to tell a joke on stage because she's very like shy, but she is like the meme queen. And she is like constantly sending me like fantastic ideas for like a cybersecurity meme. And I'll be like, you're gunning for my job. Like you're doing great. So, yeah.
I love nothing more than the like really, really niche joke that like 3 people who are experts in this one field understand, but to them it's like the funniest thing ever. That might not be the most effective way to like combat misinformation on a broad public scale, but I don't know, maybe
if you like that, Mara, you should follow the science humor subreddit. It's filled with that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I think so what Sara and Carolyn are saying, as a communication scholar, the thing I tell people the most, right, is there is a tactic that is suited to an audience, and that means you must know something about your audience, right? There is a strategy that is suited to a goal that is related to your audience, right? And so this idea of having a goal in mind is important in communication. And I would encourage scientists, and if you're communicating science, right, this probably doesn't fly as well for journalists, let's be honest, because there's a whole kind of journalistic norms, right, to think about. But to be candid and honest about what those goals are, right? What I hear a lot is that scientists want to inform people, right? But we know what happens when you give people information. They filter that through their values, and what happens is we get this kind of the partisan divides that we already see, right? Especially for issues like climate change, vaccinations. So I think being candid and honest about what is that actual goal that you're trying to achieve is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. I'm kind of combining a couple questions here from Hannah and Ashley, but is there a place for using humor to kind of try to engage an audience who is, maybe way on the other end of the spectrum from you, like the, QAnon, super anti-vax, climate denier folks, or is it, maybe better aimed at kind of the middle or people who are like at least somewhere on the spectrum of already agreeing with you?
Absolutely. I'm going to jump. Oh, was somebody else going in for this one?
No,
Okay.
go for it.
I'm going to jump this quick. Absolutely. And like one of the best, most underrated things is self-deprecating humor. Because like what's great about self-deprecating humor is when you really capture what your audience is thinking about you. So, if you're a Republican talking to liberals or, whatever end of the political spectrum, it's like, now, I bet you guys think that I have like a handgun on me, and don't worry, I don't. It's a rifle. Like something like that, where you've got like an idea of what the stereotype is in their mind, and they'll be like, how did he know that's what I was thinking? So self-deprecating humor is fantastic just for like establishing like, we're all just, you know, people trying to figure this world out. You take yourself down a little bit, you get on the person's level, and you understand the values of your audience. You know, that's a super important thing, just to like know where they're operating from. And I think it's just a really great exercise in general for building your faith up in humanity. So yeah, definitely possible to reach other people across the political spectrum by using humor. Like just yesterday, I was talking to a woman who was like very anti like epidural, who's like very into like a woman should feel the pain of childbirth. And I was like, I want an epidural just hearing you talk about the pain of childbirth. And, you know, she laughed. And I think like it set the tone of like, we're just people here. You know, I don't like judge you. Like we're having a good time. We're on the same team here is kind of the implication.
And that, yeah, that's interesting because it kind of immediately puts it in the place of like, we're disagreeing, but we're not disagreeing in an angry way. We're going to disagree or discuss this in a humorous way. Like there has to be some emotion here, but let's pick this one almost.
Right. The stakes aren't massive. Like one of the problems that I think creates a lot of tension when you're arguing with your aunt on Facebook is it feels like the two of you are policy advisors to the president. And it's like, no, it's you and your aunt on Facebook. And like the stakes are low. And ultimately you need to go to Thanksgiving together. And that's the real stakes between the two of you. So like, I think a big part of humor is frankly to say the stakes are low, because if you actually were policy advisors to the president, you probably shouldn't be joking that much. But for the vast majority of people, it's like, yeah, it's fine to realize that the you know, fate of the earth isn't hanging in the balance.
Rachel, did you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts about whether we should try to craft some jokes for QAnon?
I was going to give two answers and they both contradict one another. I think the realist in me who spends a lot of time in these spaces would say that humor is probably not a reachable tool for these kinds of communities, mostly because I think the chance of you being in front of a person and having that conversation, being able to infuse humor into it is pretty low. Most of our communication is coming through sort of mass communication channels, of which they're already inclined not to believe you. So I just don't think humor is a tool that's going to be something that attracts attention. But the optimist in me, I think after hearing Sara say those things as well, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, is like when you're trying to, what we find with a lot of the kind of QAnon or even the anti-vaxxers who are really deep down into the rabbit hole, it's not even necessarily about the information itself. It's about the kind of social element, about the values that Sara mentioned as well. And so pulling someone out the rabbit hole is really difficult because you can provide them with a fact check, but it doesn't provide them with an alternative social structure or an identity or a sense of ego that this misinformation does. And so we have to think of ways that we can actually try and intervene. And maybe that is on a more interpersonal level. And, you know, I think, Sara, you just convinced me that maybe in that interpersonal level, there is a real space for humor to kind of come in and play a leveling effect, just even to open someone's ears to have a follow-up conversation with you and hopefully, you know, pull someone up the rabbit hole that way.
So I reached across the aisle to you with humor to convince you of something. It's pretty meta.
Yeah, and I think there's a goal orientation here. I'm going to try to relieve the cognitive dissonance from the two antagonistic answers that Rachel gave, right? Because I do think that I am sort of inclined to agree that if somebody is on the other end of the spectrum, again, through these kind of broad social media channels, it's very unlikely, right, that you're going to reach someone through humor. You might make them laugh, which is a different goal from having them change their mind, right, about something. And so the goal of making them laugh, if that is done kind of in an interpersonal space, I could potentially see how this is sort of like, I get to know you better as a person. We develop some sort of relationship. Then we can have a civil conversation around an issue that we both disagree on, and maybe, you know, something changes, right? Whereas, so that's a different goal, right? I think it does work. Humor can work for people on the extremes if you're willing to kind of have a relationship and have a conversation about some dialogue, you know. But in terms of just broadcasting information and trying to change the minds of somebody else on the other side, that seems very unlikely. I do want to, somebody asked about institutional writing. And again, I would say the goal is important, the audience is important, right? And using humor in institutional writing, but also sort of, I wouldn't use biting sorts of humor.
Awesome. We're about out of time, but I just wanted to ask if anyone, if there are journalists, writers in the audience who are thinking like, okay, I have not been funny, but maybe I should try to be funny, which we all know is the best way to start being funny. Does anyone have, like one thing that maybe we could try or play around with, or something to keep in mind if we embark on this quest? Oh, you're muted.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yes.
I have some
Go for
shit
it.
to tell. Books. So we have a couple. Science for Her by Megan Amram. That's a classic.
Mm-hmm.
Humor That Works, also a good one. Planet Funny by Ken Jennings, okay, but I'd put these up more. And then finally, take an improv class. I have my improv comedy manual, but improv classes are fantastic for getting you out of your head because you literally cannot prepare for them. That's the whole point. And you are gonna suck and everyone else is. And that's kind of also the point. And so there's a great place called the Stony Brook University, which actually runs improv classes for scientists, try to get them to loosen up to communicate better. So those are some resources to start with.
Awesome.
Oh, and also contact us. I forgot the plug.
There you go. Eve, did you have something to add?
I'd just say that it seems, especially in recent years, that honestly just describing what's going on in the world straight is absurd enough that it's like there's humor in that if you can tell it just right. And yeah, I think just, I don't know, I was thinking throughout this about, can you teach a person to be funny? And I was thinking the number of people I've met in my life across all spheres, like the only ones who I'd consider genuinely, or who I'd consider like notably unfunny, are the ones who are trying really hard. Like so many people are just funny without trying. They've developed their own ways of being funny, and just like, I don't know, letting that shine through, I think is very effective if people are able to channel that.
It's almost less about like teaching ourselves to be funny than just like letting ourselves be funny and seeing what happens.
Yeah, 100%.
I have a question for Hello SciCom-ers. Can you teach people to be funny? I'm just curious, and I guess that's maybe why we have improv classes, but can you?
Absolutely. I think like a big part of it is just changing your framework, and like slowly building their confidence. Like I would say over the little while I've known Carolyn, like I've encouraged her to be more confident in like saying jokes, and she is very like presenting as like scientific and mild-mannered, but she's like one of the wildest senses of humor of anybody I've ever met. There's precious gems inside all of us. And so like I do think, frankly, like we're all capable of like appreciating the absurd. For some people, it might be so stifled that you need a therapist more than like a consulting person to help you with like unlock that block. But for like the vast majority of people, it very much is possible because everybody has laughed. It's a wonderfully unique phenomenon to the human experience. It is like, that's where the craft part comes in. So like we have, oftentimes there'll be a nugget, and the nugget is like a juxtaposition. Something weird happened in somebody's field, or there's some misconception about somebody's field. Like, let's say it's our cybersecurity expert, and she's like, you know, the thing that bothers me is what people think I do versus what I actually do. And then we'll create, and that there's a juxtaposition there. That's like humor is almost always about the unexpected, like as a rule, like more like a guideline. And so we'll take that nugget, and then that's where the craft comes in. And I'll be like, okay, what do they think your field is? And then we're like, oh, they think your field is like a movie, like a scene from a movie in The Italian Job, where it's like a guy with fingerless gloves hacking in the back of a van. And like at some point he dramatically looks up and goes, I'm in. And like, that's not how cybersecurity works. It's a lot more boring than that. And so we'll write a blog post about like 5 things, you know, that are not true about cybersecurity from movies or whatever. It'll be filled with those tropes. But what's interesting is like, I'm just applying the craft. She gave me, because she's the expert, you know, she gave me the thing that was like, here's the weird thing. And then I kind of extrapolate that out into like formal jokes or like funny writing or whatever. But it can be a collaborative process. And frankly, you just build up somebody's confidence to think about their problem that way.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is great. And this is a really, really good example of why research and practice should talk more, because your comment about humor and the unexpectedness of humor, that is in the theoretical literature on humor, right? The expectation violation theory and tension release. But yeah, it's nice to hear that in practice that also is the thing.
I did write my undergraduate thesis on humor, so I have some academic understanding, and I literally slogged my way through Freud's seminal text on humor, which ironically is the unfunniest book I've ever read in my life. Germans do not know humor. I'm going to make that as a statement. But
there is a German physicist on YouTube that does stand-up.
Hofstadter, I love her.
No, it's a man actually that I found, but now I'm going to have to get the other name from you. I'm sorry. Okay, use the YouTube clip in an experiment. That's what I did.
Okay, I'll ask you for the name later.
Awesome. Well, we are already over time, so I think we should wrap things up there. But I'm happy that we have had this conversation, discovered that there was more than one funny German physicist on YouTube, and solved the entire problem of misinformation, I think, which is what happens when we all come together. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who joined us. If anyone has more questions or thoughts, feel free to get in touch with me or with NSWA, and we can connect you as needed. And yeah, I had a great time, and I'm really glad that we did this.
Thank you.
I would just encourage everyone to connect on LinkedIn or follow each other on Twitter and make those connections. So thank you.
Oh, are the book recommendations going to be somewhere? The very quick scrolling chat just asked for the book recommendation.
There are 3 dots on the lower right of the chat, and you can save the chat locally.
Yeah, also we'll collect some of that and tweet it or email out after the event.
I tweeted it.
You're on it. Awesome. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.